Heir to a dead station, marry the widow captain or forfeit the stars. Welcome back to Sci-Fi Nebula. Tonight, a sealed will cracks open a war. A drifter returns to claim an inheritance on a rusting ring station, only to learn he must marry the widow who runs the rival arc, or lose everything to a charity fund. What begins as a cold contract becomes a siege of storms, pirates, and corporate predators. In vacuum, love isn't soft, it's a pressure hull. Buckle in. Chapter 1, The Claws. Arlen Reddix, Arlen to anybody who'd ever split a ration with him, came home to a station that smelled like old coffee and furnace dust. Gentry 8 was a ring nobody bragged about. Her panels wore scabs of micrometeor patching, her halls exhaled the slow tired breath of a habitat that had seen more winters than investors. The memorial service fit the place, low lights, recycled air, and a dozen people Arlen didn't recognize pretending they had known Willis Gentry better than he had. An urn the color of ship metal sat under a viewport smeared with the thumbprints of children who had once watched rock fields drift by. He avoided the condolences. Hands that hadn't written for a decade were suddenly eager to hold his shoulder. Arlen kept moving until the legal AI rolled out on squeaking casters like a bureaucratic coffin with wheels. It extended a display. Its voice was sanded smooth and inhuman. Last will and testament, Willis T. Gentry, recorded. Bequeath, prospector array G, all assets, leases, and rights. Condition precedent, heir must enter binding cohab charter with Captain Kara Carrin, registered spouse and widow of Samuel Carrin of Broken Arrow Arc, within 1 standard year of this reading. Failure enacts Clause 2, transfer of all G holdings to the Orphan Fund of Casper Reach. The room went glacier quiet. Somewhere, a hatch cycled and made the sound of a man swallowing too late. A cohab charter wasn't romance. Out here it was law and oxygen, a marriage of accounts and liability that meant your heir and hers were the same ledger entry. Arlen felt a dozen faces tilt and measure his spine. He looked at the AI. What if she declines, he asked. Then the condition fails, the box said. Clause 2 executes. The fund thanks you for your generosity. A laugh, one of those sharp, mean ones, pipped up from the back. Arlen didn't turn. He looked out the viewport instead. Beyond the smears, the belt rolled like a slow river of broken teeth. They held the wake in the cargo ring. Cans clinked. Old stories unfurled, trimmed of shame. Arlen stood apart until a woman in a matte black vac coat stepped through the hatch and silence folded itself out of her way. He recognized her from rumor long before the mesh stamped on her breast, Broken Arrow Arc, Kara Carrin. Widow of Samuel, who died in a bubble suit with the seal gone to threads. Keeper of a smaller, sharper station that did not creak when you breathed. She had a face built for hard math and green eyes that promised a man he'd better bring numbers if he brought anything at all. Her gaze swept the room and settled on Arlen like a welled light. He straightened, then wished he hadn't, because at 6'6" he always looked like trouble glued to legs. Arlen Reddix, she said. Not a question. He nodded. Captain Carrin. No one said condolences. It would have been ugly sport to talk about dead husbands and dead uncles in the same breath as contracts. You'll want to say something, she said, eyes steady. About the clause. He could have put on charm. He could have arranged his mouth into respectability. Instead, grief stripped him down to the frame and honesty fell out. I don't know you, he said. And I won't pretend this isn't a noose with legal citations. But I'm not here to be rich off a man's bones. I'm here because this station is the first thing that was almost mine. He swallowed. I can work. Something like a smile threatened the corner of her mouth, and then, wisely, did not arrive. Work is cheaper than vows, she said. We'll start there. She tipped her chin toward the hatch. Your north radials are shedding panels. You've got ice in line 2 of your recyclers, and the mag fence flickers like an old prayer. Court me by fixing what you call home. Court, he said, and heard the word sit wrong in his own mouth. Call it testing a hull before you stake your life inside. She stepped back into the corridor, coat whispering. Dawn cycle. Show up with a wrench. Leave the flowers. The wake watched her go. Arlen stared at the smear of the belt and thought about promises a dead man had made for him. Then he went to the tool cage. Dawn on Gentry 8 was a timer lie. Someone had told the lights to be warmer, someone had piped a birdsong file that had been poor when it was new. Arlen stood on the outside skin 8 hours later with his tether clipped and the cold making a line from his teeth to his boots. Below him, above him, everywhere, the belt wheeled, the ring hummed. He set a patch panel against a scar and drove fasteners home with a rhythm that sounded like a heart learning how again. Kara arrived on the mag track with a speed that didn't show off and did anyway. She clipped in beside him, popped her visor, and let frost kiss her dark hair. You left the seam long, she said. It'll contract on the dark side, he answered. Better to kiss than to gap. She glanced sidelong, reassessing. You were what? Construction. Whatever paid yesterday, he said. Rail, mine, dock, ship. I burned through trades like they were stepping stones. He tightened the last fastener. Turns out they were cliffs. Then stop falling, she said. Line 2 next. They moved through the station like surgeons in a body that refused to die. Kara didn't praise. She didn't need to. She handed the right tool before he asked. She listened to the faint pitch a seal made as it seated, and he heard her hear it. The station's hum smoothed under their hands and the air tasted less like regret. By midday cycle, his arms ached and his stubbornness had softened into something like belonging. She stood in the recycler bay doorway watching him flush line 2. You said you can work, she said. You can. Is that a yes to the clause? He asked. Stupid question. Brave one. It's a yes to tomorrow, she said. I make those one at a time. She turned to go. If you want more than tomorrow, bring a week. He watched her leave and thought about weeks as riches. He wrapped the line with his last strip of tape and felt the station breathe easier. News travels along corridors faster than air. By shift change, Broken Arrow hands had drifted over to see if the air was a fool. They found a man who had not left his wrench in the wrong place even once. Kara let that rumor stand. She didn't tell them she'd seen him hesitate when a child ran past with grease on both cheeks and called him, sir. She didn't tell them she'd watched his face when he passed the viewport where the urn had sat. Night cycle, such as it was, found them on the skin again, tracing a mag fence flicker that danced like a misfired synapse. The fence was a thin ribbon of blue that kept micrometeors from chewing the station like rats. It sputtered as they reached the junction. There, Arlen said, pointing with his chin. Ferrofoam crack in the insulator. It arcs when the temperature drops. Kara nodded. We can splice. Or we can shut the run and lose coverage on the east grazing tether. Can't lose the tether, he said. Your algae beds ride on it. Station starves. She watched him test the crack with a gloved thumb. The gesture was gentle. Competent. Like a man touching a suprasternal notch to feel if a pulse is honest. Splice it is, she said. They were finishing the wrap when the fence brightened and the station's sensors made a sound she had learned to hate. Movement, she said. Service drones on a dead circuit. Old ones. Hunger wolves, he said, using the ringer slang for feral bots that learned to hunt warm things. 3 of them slipped through the field like thoughts you don't invite. They were built for repair, they had learned appetite. Kara's hand found her sidearm. Arlen's gloved palm settled on the truss, bracing. Don't shoot near the insulator, he said. We lose the fence. They'll chew the tether, she snapped. He lifted his palm, showed the small ping emitter he'd palmed from the tool rack. We can call them. She blinked. That was either brilliant or stupid enough to kill them both. He pulsed the emitter twice, 3 times. The drones hesitated, noses, if you could call them that, tilting to the sound like dogs recalling a trainer from a dream of blood. He pulsed again, then threw the emitter hard toward the maintenance rail. The drones wheeled in a silver curl and followed the lure down the long throat of the station. "Run," Kara said, smiling despite herself. They ran. They reached the hatch and slammed it and listened to the drones howl along the other side. Kara laughed, breath fogging. "Courtship by wrench," she said. "And by not dying stupid." He leaned his head back against the hatch. "I can bring that," he said, surprised at his own voice. She studied him for a measured second. "Then, bring it tomorrow." He did. For a week. Then for 2. By the time the legal AI rolled back to gently remind them about clauses and calendars, Kara had already decided what kind of man he was when the station hurt. She didn't say yes. Not yet. The belt had storms to throw and she wanted to see which way Arlen bent when wind hit steel. The wind was coming. You could taste it in the air. Even if air was recycled. Chapter 2, Courtship by Wrench. On belt rings, seasons were events, not calendars. Ion winter announced itself with a smear across the sun like a bruise ripening. The monitors sang of charged particles. Old men on the ring said their joints could feel the CME 3 days before the graphs agreed. Arlen and Kara worked faster. They replaced the micromesh on the skin where dust could sandblast through. They tensioned the tether that held the algae beds in the sweet spot where light still kissed but debris thinned. They taught the new kid, Tom, 19, with hands too big for the gloves and a grin too quick, how to listen to a seal by the sound it made in your bones. In the hours between, Arlen learned Kara's station the way a man learns a town he thinks might be his last, by the names people gave the same corridor, by which hatch a widower opened first when he needed company, by where the children ran when they were pretending not to be afraid of thunder that happened without clouds. He also learned Kara. She counted inventory like rosary beads. She rationed praise like oxygen. She carried her grief silent and kept it busy, repairs, schedules, supply runs, so that it didn't have time to chew through bulkheads. She knew the names of everyone who'd ever been born on Broken Arrow and the date the oldest air compressor had first been switched on. Once, at the recycler, he asked, "Why didn't you sell?" She tightened a bolt and did not look up. "Samuel bought it with his hands," she said. "I wasn't going to give it away with my fear." "You loved him," he said, and did not make it a question. "I married because I believed in building," she said. "I loved because we bled and it was worth it." He nodded. She did not tell him that when Samuel's seal had failed, the station had hummed in a pitch she now associated with dying. She did not tell him she'd refused to replace the panel that still bore a scuff from that day. She'd kept it to remember what seals were for. On Gentry 8, grief wore a different face. Willis Gentry had been as stubborn as a radiator that refused to die. He'd raised Arlen halfway, then let him slip away to any job that paid more excitements than rent. Their affection had been a series of muted acknowledgments, like passing a wrench back and forth under a machine you both needed. When Arlen asked the legal AI for a copy of the will, it played the video clause, the same words, different day. Willis looked into the lens like he could see the boy who'd run. "You're good with your hands, Arlen. Good with leaving. Marry a woman who respects the first and hates the second." Arlen didn't cry. He hung a tool on the right peg just to have something correct in front of him. They argued for the first time the day the feral drones returned. "Shoot," Tom hissed, voice eel-slippery with fear, as 3 hunger wolves nuzzled the algae bed frame like carnivores deciding where to bite. Kara lifted her rifle. Arlen caught her wrist. "If we pop them, we puncture the bed," he said. "We lose a month of protein. We lose a station if they chew the tethers," she snapped. Tom's grip on the rail went sweaty. The drones clacked their little titanium teeth. Arlen dug in his pocket and came up with a spool of wire and a magnet. "Give me 60 seconds, he said. "This isn't the time to invent a religion," Kara said, but she didn't lower the rifle. He tied the magnet to the wire and knotted the other end to a wrench that had already saved them twice. He hummed a note he'd learned from the recycler, the exact frequency that had stilled the machine when it wanted to shake itself apart. The wire vibrated against the magnet. The drones tilted their heads again. He tossed the wrench and wire combination toward the far service bay. It clanged. The drones flowed after it, hungry for the song of metal. He slammed the hatch. Kara's exhale was almost a laugh, and almost not. "You're making a habit of not dying," she said. "Try to keep it consistent." Tom wiped his palms on his suit legs. "Did you just fish?" "Dogs like bells," Arlen said. "So do wolves if you put them in the right bodies." Kara looked at him like a problem she was reluctant to admit she enjoyed solving. "Tomorrow," she said. "We reinforce the bed frames with the metal they actually want to chew." "Copy," he said, and for once the word felt like an oath. Courtship by wrench is boring and hard, the way real love sneaks up when everyone thinks it's going to knock. They fixed, they ate, they slept. He brought her coffee that tasted like a good mistake. She handed him a comb, engine oil for hair, she warned with a not smile. He found a half-cracked mirror. She pretended she didn't care. He found the right light and left it there. At the end of the second week, Kara stood in the corridor outside the legal AI's dock. "Arlen," she said, and he stilled because she didn't use first names unless she was about to offer something he could ruin by talking. "I'm not saying yes because a dead man wrote a clause," she said. "I'm saying yes to a charter trial because I've watched you carry a station without making it carry you." She stuck out her hand. "Bond charter. 90 days. Review after. No guarantees. No performances. We do the work and see if the air tastes like ours." He took her hand. It was cool and clean and the shake was firm. He didn't say thank you. He said, "What needs done first?" She smiled then, the small, private one that had almost arrived on day one. "We go by a son." He laughed despite himself. "On your account?" "On yours," she said. "You're buying us a shield upgrade." "Ah," he said. "The romance of procurement." She let herself grin. "You wanted to court. They got the shield." Arlen bartered. Kara browbeat. Together they made a vendor cry in a way that turned into a discount. They bolted the new panels on the skin and listened as the station's song shifted a step closer to what you want a home to sound like. That night, the vents breathed warm. People moved through the corridors softer. The belt outside the viewport looked less like teeth and more like river glass. In the dark, Kara lay awake harder than she meant to. She pressed her fingers to her lower belly and felt nothing, which is sometimes something, which is sometimes hope. She didn't tell him. Not yet. First you survived the storm, then you admit you wanted spring. Ion Winter licked the edge of the sky. Chapter 3, Ion Winter. The first flare slapped the ring like a parent with old anger. Lights dropped low. Alarms forgot their calm. The station's old bones groaned as charged particles tore at the shield and made it sing in a key that wakes babies and widows. Arlen was in the environmental bay when the pitch went wrong. He didn't think. He moved, up the ladder, through the corridor, body learning the ship's shortcuts the way hands learn the location of a lover's scars. The gauge by the mag fence flirted with red. The algae beds, protein for the ark, bobbed at their tether ends like hooked fish. Kara was already in a suit at the airlock, visor down, jaw set. Tom stood white-knuckled behind her, trying to pretend he didn't pray. "Stay inside," she told the boy. "If we both blow a seal, someone needs to lock the hatch." Tom nodded. His mouth made the shape of OK and the sound didn't come. Arlen clipped in beside Kara. "You could order me to stay," he said. She handed him a spanner. "I could," she said. "But I don't like failing alone." They dropped to the skin. The belt had gone to storm. Ion snow peeled off the sun and skittered along the shield in blue tongues. The tether shivered. A feral drone, one of the hunger wolves, tore at a frame and sparked like a bad idea. Arlen swore. Kara shot. The drone pinwheeled off into the dark, trailing sparks like a dying firework. "Panel," she shouted over the comm. He slammed the spanner into the mount and twisted. The panel slid into place with a sound that should have been applause. The blue tongues hissed and slid away, disappointed. On the other side of the arc, the station coughed. Arlen felt it through his boots. "You learn your home by its stumbles." He pivoted, pointed. "Reactor line 3. Kara was already moving. They skated the skin like thieves off a balcony and hit the hatch hard enough to rattle teeth. Inside, the heat was wrong. Dr. Elon Ashby, Heir nodded back, face set in that let-me-work way medics wear when they're pretending not to do fear, met them in the corridor. "Good," she snapped. "You're alive. Now keep the power steady." "We got you," Kara said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Ashby turned to Arlen. "Once the line holds, come to the residential bay." "Someone hurt?" he asked, already dreading the answer it would be, the ones with names. "Not hurt," she said. "And I'm not telling her yet, but," she flicked her eyes to Kara for a fraction. "Soon." Kara didn't have time to decode anyone's half-sentence. She was already at the panel for line 3, hands sure and fast. Arlen grabbed the thermal sleeve and fed it while she welded. Sparks painted their visors with tiny starfields. The pitch of the reactor smoothed from scream to growl to breath. "Hold," Arlen said, and the line obeyed. They sealed the panel and ran for residential. Dr. Ashby waited at the end of a corridor that felt longer than it had any right to be. She lifted a hand, stopped Kara with a touch to the forearm, gentler than you'd expect from someone who has stitched people in the dark. "I would have told you after," she said, quiet but steady. "But there's no after with storms. There's only now." Kara's eyes were already fierce. "Say it." Dr. Ashby's glance cut to Arlen, then back. "Your test came back. You're pregnant." Silence did a strange thing. It filled her ears with the sound of the station humming and then took that away too. Kara's face didn't change much, the way her breath moved inside her did. Her hand, gloved, shaking, rose and pressed against her lower belly as if she could hold the entire station inside with her fingers. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "Too early to be easy," Ashby said. "Too late to ignore. I want you down. Med Bay." "I've got a station peeling like paint," Kara said. "You've got a child who doesn't care about your pride," the doctor said, and somehow it wasn't cruel, only correct. Kara turned her face toward Arlen as if looking into vacuum to get a clearer picture. "Can you hold it?" she asked him. He had never been given anything that precious in a sentence. "Yes," he said, voice rough. "Go." She went. Storms make hours elastic. They pull minutes long as hunger and crush days into a fist. Arlen lived inside a map made of alarms and the names of people who could do more than they were afraid of. Tom became a runner with the speed of a kid who remembers games to keep from crying. The hunger wolves came twice more, both times they learned what a station does to things that try to chew it in a storm. In the Med Bay, Dr. Ashby worked with the quiet, commanding efficiency of a woman who had convinced death to wait in a chair many times. Kara lay on a narrow bed with monitors stuck to the places where women stop pretending bodies are only for labor. The storm howled in the wires and the baby disagreed with rhythm. "Talk to me," Kara said to the ceiling. "What about?" Arlen asked over comm, breathless from a sprint he'd just lost to a failing pump he refused to let quit. Anything less stupid than fear, she said. He laughed. I once talked a vendor into selling me a son, he said. I was there, she said. You almost smiled when the discount hit. Then a story you weren't there for, he said, hand in a junction box, elbow deep in warm danger. I worked rail on Mars once. Learned how to tell ice by the way it thawed. If it cried, it was old. If it sighed, it was young. And what am I? She asked, and there was humor and declarative bravery layered so tight it read as composure. You're the sound the station makes when it survives, he said. The pump coughed and then sang. He closed his eyes for a second he couldn't spare. At Odark Terrible, the storm took a breath. In that beat, the med bay learned what the word now does to a child who has not been told it is time. Dr. Ashby's voice went low and absolute. We're doing this. Kara, breathe. You, a nod to a nurse who had fixed pipes 2 decks up half an hour ago, hold that field. Arlen didn't ask permission. He arrived breathless and useless and then wasn't either. He braced a panel with his shoulder so the monitor stopped screaming. He counted. He counted because men count when they can't carry and want to help. Kara was not brave because she pretended the pain wasn't a knife. She was brave because she held the knife in her teeth and said through it, now. A thin cry, weak but true, threaded the storm's scream. Arlen forgot how to be a man. He was something softer, older, wired to an ancient success. He cried into his knuckles like someone who had meant to live alone and wasn't allowed anymore. Dr. Ashby cleaned a mouth that had never breathed air and slapped the smallest back she'd seen this year. The child argued. Good. The doctor smiled in that tight, private way medics do when they let a wilder part of them speak, then quieted it fast. He's here, she said. He's small. He's early. But he's here. Kara's eyes found Arlen's and made a bridge tighter than any tether outside. Samuel, she said, and the name was a kindness that gave the dead a place at the table without dragging them into the chair. Middle, Willis. Arlen nodded, throat gone to rust. Samuel Willis Reddix, he said, softly, like it was a password a station would love. The storm beat the hull until Dawn Cycle remembered its cue and warmed the lights. Somewhere, a hunger wolf drifted into the dark with a bullet hole for a heart. Somewhere else, a boy named Tom ate a stale cookie like it was a medal. In the med bay, Arlen counted his son's breaths and pretended he wasn't praying to a god he usually didn't. Kara slept like a woman who had wrestled a train and then told it where to go. Dr. Ashby sat on a stool with her head in her hands for exactly 20 seconds and then stood as if she hadn't dug anyone out from under anything at all. Outside the viewport, the belt looked like it always had, cold and indifferent and beautiful in a way that makes people want to build anyway. Arlen kissed the place on his son's head that smelled like iron and ozone and future. Welcome home, he said. Chapter 4, Rust and Oath. Ion winter didn't end so much as tire itself out. The sun stopped throwing knives, the shield stopped singing in the pitch that made hands shake. The Ark exhaled. On Gentry 8, the smell of burnt dust drifted up from the power spine like an old campfire that had finally learned regret. In the med bay, baby Samuel learned to breathe without a monitor's metronome. He was small, wrist bone small, bird small, but he had a way of gripping Arlen's finger that suggested treaties and ultimatums. Kara slept with the kind of surrender that only arrives when the battle defines itself as over for now. Dr. Arlen Ashby sat at her console pretending to file charts while actually watching 2 lives she had negotiated into staying. The first trouble after the storm did not announce itself with alarms. It wore polite boots and a grin, a pair of skimmer crews from Offering who claimed they'd come to trade algae for coolant. Their ship smelled like unlicensed fuel. Their hull carried a dozen stories of places that never issued docking receipts. Kara walked the perimeter with them and smiled the way station captains do when they are tallying exits. Arlen walked a second perimeter inside hers, listening for the sound of someone touching what wasn't theirs. They left with nothing but coffee and suspicion. 2 nights later, the suspicion grew teeth. A grazing tether cut itself in the dark, no alarm, just a dead segment where a live one should be. Arlen reached the skin first, the tether shaking like a fishing line in bad hands. By the time he got the emergency clamp on, the algae beds had drifted a meter off their lane and a skimmer ghosted past the shield at the edge where cameras lose interest. Rustlers, Kara said, jaw tight. Or neighbors practicing, Arlen said, because he didn't like how fast the word enemy accelerates men. On the third night, a line cabin outside Gentry's ring, little more than a pressure can welded to a strut where a maintenance tech slept between shifts, failed to cycle its check-in ping. Clay Barnes found the cabin at dawn. Clay was a tracker by temperament and trade, a taciturn lattice of tendon and restraint who could read the belt the way some men read palms. He hovered outside the hatch and watched the frost pattern around the seam for a full 90 seconds before he eased it open. Inside lay Pete Morley, an old hand whose left knee made weather predictions and whose right laugh made children braver. He'd been shot once, clean, through the sternum. The drawer under the bed, standard place for a sidearm when you want to believe in rules, was open and empty. Clay sealed the hatch like a prayer. He didn't say what everyone already knew, somebody wasn't just hungry. Somebody had decided to teach the ring a lesson. At the community meet in Gentry's cargo ring, voices came in hot and unhelpful, the way grief yanks men up out of their chairs and points them at whatever looks like the next thing to fight. Kara stood on a crate, hands bare, and lifted her palm. The ring quieted because the ring trusted her to decide which fires were worth air. "We do this stupid," she said, "we make more widows." Arlen moved beside her. "We do nothing," he added, "we make them write about us." A woman with a hairnet still on from the baker's shift crossed her arms. "What then?" "Structure," Kara said. "Signals you can read at a glance. Beacons that say help, come, stay away, safe to sleep." "We'll call it the lantern net," said an engineer with 2 toddlers wrapped around his ankles. "Don't call it anything," Kara said. "Just run it." They did. They hung narrow beam lamps at the ends of spokes, coded to blink in patterns the belt had used for a century. They rigged thermal plumes to rise out of service vents, steam in the old world, here, disciplined heat, so a person could look across the ring forest and know if they were alone. They taught children to count pulses in their heads. They assigned the chef on Broken Arrow to beekeeper. She would tap a spoon against a steel rail in a rhythm that woke men deeper than sleep. Arlen built the other half, patrols that weren't heroes. He called the thing he assembled the Casper Reach Cooperative because names make people stand up straighter. Every arc within 200 clicks sent 2 hands. They pooled scanners that had been hoarded out of habit and mapped the shadowed places rustlers liked to park a ship while it cooled. He set schedules that respected fatigue because he had lived the math of error. Clay Barnes took the night lanes, drifting beside the Ardent like a thought that almost knows your next step. There were arguments, there always are when authority stands on crates instead of uniforms. Men who had never saluted wanted to play general. Arlen put them on inventory because some boys stop a fight better with a clipboard than a gun. Women with hairnets showed up at mid-shift with stew and told men to stop pretending food after midnight isn't strategy. Dr. Ashby trained 5 people on trauma seals because she would be damned if she ran between arcs in a storm with a med bag and a prayer ever again. The rustlers probed the net and found it held. A silent ship sidled up to a freight lock and found a man named Jonas standing there with a wrench and 5 neighbors behind him. A hatch tested at 0300 pinged open to reveal a baker, a taut grandmother with a dart gun, and 2 teenagers with the task of shouting no. Without apology. People at the edge ceased to be alone. It wasn't enough to hold. It was enough to wait for grief to become less sharp and more heavy. Sometimes that's victory. Through it all, Samuel slept in a cradle Arlen bolted to the floor because he had learned what inertia does to dreams. Kara walked differently now, hand low when she moved through a hatch, a pause between ladders. She refused to be candlelit for being pregnant, she kept her steel and added a seam of wool. On the 65th day of their 90-day charter, The legal AI squeaked up to them again and displayed a countdown as if they hadn't been adding hours together like resin and fiber. Kara looked at the numbers and then at Arlen. "Do you want this because a man died and wrote a rule," she asked, "plain as a surface with no rust, or because you woke up here without regret more than once?" Arlen didn't reach for her hand. Hands were easy. He lifted his chin to look at the ugly places, the patched panel where Pete used to sit and tell lies, the dent in the corridor where Tom had slipped and laughed anyway, the smudge on the viewport from where Willis had always leaned his head to watch the belt. "I want to sign because when I fix things here, I'm not thinking about leaving," he said. "And because I can do this beside you without feeling smaller." Kara nodded once, as if checking a seam and finding it sound. "Then we do it right. No church, no choir." They met in the recycler bay because it was the warmest room and because it fed people and kept them alive, which is the truest work of a marriage. Clay stood awkwardly to the side with oil on his hands. Dr. Ashby wore clean gloves like a priest wears lace. Tom held a ring Arlen had turned on a lathe from a scrap of hull that had saved them in the storm. The legal AI printed a contract that smelled faintly of hot plastic and compromise. Kara signed first, pen steady, mouth in the line she used for choosing expensive parts. Arlen signed next and felt something unclench he hadn't known was his fingers. Vows don't need poetry. They need particulars. "I'll take the midnight shift when your back hurts," Arlen said. "I'll tell you when you're wrong before the station does," Kara said. "I'll count the spare seals twice. I'll let you name the second child if you stop calling procurement romantic." A laugh went around the room like a cup passed. Tom sniffed and pretended it was the oil. Clay looked at the ring and blinked like a man who had stared at emptiness long enough to be surprised when a thing existed. Kara slid the band onto Arlen's finger. He slid hers on, a twin, edged with a hairline seam that caught light like the idea of morning. He kissed her, which was not for the room but also was, because a ring is a public thing in a place this small. Later, when the lights went low and the belt ran like a slow river, Arlen sat with Samuel on his shoulder and watched Kara sleep. He touched the ring against the newborn's foot, a faint tap, metal to skin, oath to future. The lantern net pulsed once outside the viewport, all's well in the old code. He didn't believe in omens, he believed in work. Still, he let the light sit inside him like heat. 3 cycles later, the first letter from Concordant Minerals arrived in a courier's clean hands, and the part of the story where work alone fixes things ended. Chapter 5, The Long Knife of Law. The envelope was the sort of expensive that existed to suggest inevitability. Cream paper. Hollow watermark that chased your eyes. Theo Blackwood, Concordant Minerals and Development, embossed in a font that had probably been bundled with other forms of coercion. Kara slid it open with her thumbnail. Arlen read over her shoulder because he understood that some words were knives that wanted both of them. Notice of mineral rights, pursuant to the Spectral Vein Act and associated claims filed with the Casper Reach Tribunal, Concordant Minerals asserts discovery of quantum or beneath parcels designated Gentry 8 and Broken Arrow Arc. In accordance with law, surface occupancy must yield to subsurface extraction. A generous relocation package is enclosed. Arlen made a sound that might have been a laugh if a laugh were allowed to carry a weight this sharp. "Quantum ore," he said. "That's not a rock. That's a line in an earnings report." Kara flipped the page for the number. It was large enough to impress anyone whose life had not been measured in welds. It would buy an exit you could live with until the first morning you woke up and realized you'd sold the sound a station makes when it recognizes you. "They want the ring," Kara said. "They want the corridor," Arlen answered. "No one digs ore from a thin rock field without bleeding credits. But you can lay a jump spur through a place like this if you've mapped it quiet." "You're guessing." "I'm remembering," he said. "Worked 3 jobs for a rail that swore it was never coming. Woke up to pylons on the horizon and a letter that spelled inevitable the same way as this one." Concordance rep arrived on a skimmer wearing a smile trained to look patient. He introduced himself as Blackwood without offering a hand because he understood Kara would leave it where it was. He praised Samuel and said "child" too many times to hide the fact that the word made him uncomfortable. He asked to tour the recycler in the tone of a man who liked to remind people he could buy water they were born drinking. "You're asserting an or claim," Kara said as they walked the corridor. "What's it called?" "Quantum ore," he said smoothly. "An energy-dense substrate." "Is it heavy?" she cut in. "What color is it when you break it open? Does it stain your gloves? Does it make the water taste like coins? Does it hum?" Blackwood's smile thinned like a membrane stretched over something whose shape he didn't want her to see. "Captain Carrin, the legalities." "Do you know what it is?" she asked. He didn't answer because he couldn't answer without naming the lie. "Concordant stands ready to make this transition painless. Your family will be." "My family doesn't live on a number," Kara said. "It lives on a cycle: morning, repairs, bread, laughter, sleep." "Cycles move," he said. "You can transplant routine to a safer orbit. This ring is," his gaze flicked to a patch panel Arlen had installed, "aging." "Leave," Kara said. He inclined his head like a man departing a negotiation that would soon return on his terms. "We'll file with the tribunal," he said. "You'll find the law is persuasive." The Casper Reach Cooperative met that night. The lantern net pulsed the code for all hands and the cargo ring filled with people who knew how to ask better questions than the ones men in clean boots bring. "They're not mining," Arlen told them. "They're scouting a spur. There's no ore here. There is a corridor a jump rail would kill to buy cheap." "No offense," said Jonas, the man with the wrench and the 5 neighbors, "but that's a big claim from a guy who last month told us wolves could be taught to follow a bell." "He's right," Clay Barnes said from the back, and the room turned because Clay only spent words like currency. "I've seen concordant scouts years out. They fake or to get the law on their side, then sell to rails in dark rooms." "We don't have a rail yet," the baker said. "We have a letter. And a law that lets dynamics beat deeds," Dr. Ashby added. "Minerals in this territory have precedence. So we fight law with law," Kara said. "And truth with scans." They formed 2 teams before fatigue could break their courage. Arlen and Clay would run a shadow survey, gravimetric sweeps, muon scattering, neutrino resonance sniffers, borrowed, begged, hacked together from equipment that used to be used to find leaks and now would find lies. Kara would organize paper, tribunal petitions, injunction drafts, signatures on a charter that said this place existed long before a man in a clean jacket could pronounce its name. In the quiet after, Arlen stood with Clay at the Ardence ramp going over lists that smelled like solder and intent. "You believe me," Arlen said without turning his head. Clay checked the case on a grav meter like a farmer checks a hinge. "I believe in patterns," he said. "Egg-smooth men coming to tell us what's best for us smells like weather I've seen." They ran the sweep nights because Concordant liked to fly drones that woke up angry at noon. The Ardent slid between rock and ring, her signature shaved so thin she read as a sigh. Arlen watched the graphs rise and fall in the green glow, Clay watched the dark and told him when to look again. They found what the belt always tells you when you bother to listen: ordinary. Basalt, ice, broken teeth. No dense seam. No hum in the water. No taste of coins on the tongue when you warmed a chip of rock in your hand. But they also found extraordinary at the edges, tiny powered beacons hidden in the boneyards where old girders drifted. Someone had seeded the field with reference points, the sort of triangulation a rail uses to chart where it will someday punch a hole in space and call it convenience. Clay plucked one beacon from a truss with gloved fingers so gentle it would have embarrassed a midwife. "Never been here," he murmured. "Only read here." Arlen turned the beacon over in his hand. The metal was too clean. The serial was shaved. The anchoring glue was still young enough to smell. He pictured a crew in a nicer ship than the Ardent, one night 2 months back, toggling this thing active and logging the coordinate with a laugh. He felt his jaw harden against a future in which Samuel learned to say "we used to." They returned with scans and beacons in a bag and went straight to the tribunal clerk, a woman with red eyes from reading, who flipped through the thin codebook the belt pretended was law and said, "You are the first people to bring me neutrino scatter on an injunction petition." "We're happy to be boring in new ways," Kara said, standing too straight for someone whose back hurt, refusing a chair because chairs imply asking permission. The clerk stamped a receipt and whispered like a traitor who has just remembered which side she chose. "You'll need a real advocate," she said. "Concordant will eat you if you think truth is a meal that feeds itself." "Harrison Fletcher," Dr. Ashby said later, when the name came up in the Lantern Net's private thread. "Cheyenne. He hates men like Blackwood on principle and retainer." "We can't afford him," Jonas said, counting bills already committed to bolts and bread. "I can," Kara said, voice even. "My father left me money to run when I needed to. I decided not to run. This is another kind of not running." Arlen looked at her and saw the woman who had said yes to a charter in a recycler bay because O's mean more when the air is noisy. "We'll pay it back," he said. "We won't," she said. "We'll pay it forward to a place where my son won't have to learn how fast a man with a letter can turn a home into an asset." Blackwood returned with 2 men in boots that scuffed floors to make owners flinch. He presented a stack of filings heavy enough to bruise a table and a smile that hoped to bruise resolve. "You people are making this harder than it needs to be," he said to the room. "We're offering fair relocation. This ring squeaks. Your arcs leak. Your child will breathe easier somewhere built this century." Dr. Ashby stepped forward before Arlen could spoil his teeth on a reply. "My patients breathe because this place exists," she said, voice like metal correctly chosen for a load. "Their lungs work because we keep them warm and fed. Leave my medical bay out of your calculus or I'll add your name to a list that gets people left waiting." Blackwood's smile did not reach his eyes because they were too busy counting. "Captain Carrin," he turned, "you are, of course, the decision here." Kara's green eyes did a quiet thing that made men with law degrees forget which page they were on. "I was the decision when your men cut Pete Morley's tether," she said. "I was when you stuck beacons in our boneyards. I was when I married a man who knew how to hold a wrench and keep his promises. You don't get a vote." Blackwood's jaw ticked. "We'll see what the tribunal says." "We will," she said. "We'll bring them rocks to taste." He left because he had other places to be disliked. Arlen watched him go and felt the tight, cold pleasure that comes when a man's threats are smaller than his face. That night, the Lantern Net blinked all's well because nobody had died, and sometimes that's the only metric you get to celebrate. Arlen lay awake with Samuel sleeping on his chest and Kara curled at his side, breathing the slow breath of a person who has convinced her body to trust her for a few hours. "Law's a long knife," he said into the dark. "Hold the handle," she murmured, not fully awake, "and don't cut the wrong thing." In the morning, the Arden would fly again with Clay in the jump seat and a list of coordinates that smelled like a lie. In a week, if Fletcher said yes, a man who knew how to wear a suit without letting it wear him would stand in a room and say words that turned beacons into evidence and letters into smoke. Out the viewport, the belt turned like a slow certainty. The ring hummed in its better key. The baby's hand found Arlen's ring and gripped it with the same unreasonable confidence as before. He let the small weight decide his next breath. "Okay," Arlen whispered to the ceiling he had patched with careful hands. "We fight." Chapter 6, Home Invasion. Concordant didn't knock. They never do, not when they're certain the paperwork has made them gods. They arrived during second shift, the hour when the station's hum sinks low and even the stubborn rest their backs. The skimmer's paint wore a color named for trust. Its docking request used the word wellness. Arlen was out with Clay in the Ardent, running one more sweep along the boneyard to find the last of the shaved serial beacons. Kara walked the spine with Samuel strapped to her chest, his breath a moth against her heart, when the Lantern Net ticked once, the private code Dr. Ashby had asked the network to use for uninvited medicine. A man stepped through the lock with two others flanking him. They wore polite coats. Under the coats, holsters. The leader smiled with his teeth. Captain Carrin. Theodore Blackwood sends his regards. We're here to conduct a welfare check. This station is well, Kara said. Leave. He glanced past her at the cradle bolted to the floor in the galley, at the plants in the narrow light, at the patches that told a story of labor instead of money. We've had complaints, he said. Unsafe conditions. A child in a recycler bay during a solar event. Very concerning. He let the words drift toward Samuel like smoke, watched for their effect. Kara didn't touch the rifle hanging on the wall. She kept her hands where they were, the way you do when a machine might misread you. We have a tribunal injunction pending, she said. Your presence violates. Ah, he said, regret folding neatly across his face. Injunctions are so temperamental. They fail for the smallest of reasons. Delays. Filings misplaced. Judges called away. We're here now. The hallway behind him filled with quiet. Not men with guns, yet. Men with clipboards. The kind who like to say regretfully before they steal. Kara turned her head enough to catch Dr. Ashby's reflection in the viewport. The doctor had taken the long way round the corridor so her arrival would look like an accident. She wore no white coat, only her old jacket and a tired expression. Gentlemen, Ashby said, if you're here to make trouble, make it in my med bay. I've more disinfectant there. The leader's smile found a new target. Dr. Ashby, he said. My clients admire your work. They've funded clinics in 3 rings. And I've treated the workers they injured to build them, she said. Captain, shall I log these men as unauthorized visitors who refuse to submit to Deccan? Kara nodded once. The leader's jaw flexed. We're authorized, he said softly. By people who do not enjoy being thwarted. Let's not let inconvenience turn into tragedy. His gaze flicked to the child swaddled against her. Stress is so dangerous for infants. Kara's blood went to quartz. You're finished here, she said. He took a small step closer. Am I? A sound like a gunshot cracked the air. Everyone flinched, then realized it was a spanner hitting a rail. Tom stood on the catwalk above, 19 years and too thin in a jumpsuit that had been Arlen's once. The boy held a coil gun two-handed. It looked as big as he did. His face was pale but the aim was steady. Leave, Tom said. His voice cracked and kept going. You don't belong here. The leader did not reach for his holster because even stupid men learn. He lifted his hands with the weary patience of a father indulging a child. No one wants anyone hurt, he said. We came to talk. Kara took one step sideways, careful, and palmed the comm panel. The lantern net took her thumb and lit 3 silent lamps up the corridor like beads on a string. Neighbors would see. Jonas would stand up from his stew. The baker would set down her spoon. Clay, if the ardent was in range, would turn hard for home. Talk, Kara said. From the other side of my lock. He smiled again, smaller. We'll be back with the marshal, he said. You'll be back with a court order, Dr. Ashby corrected. Bring one signed with a hand that knows how to hold a pen without breaking it. They went. Polite coats. Regretful smiles. A last look that promised later. When the lock cycled, Tom's coil gun clattered against the rail because his hands had stopped pretending they weren't shaking. Kara reached up, took the weapon, set it down. Good, she said, and the word was a blanket. You did good. I thought I was going to, he swallowed. I thought I couldn't. You did, she said. You will again, if you must. But we'll try to keep you baking bread instead of pointing guns. He snorted a laugh that was halfway a sob. Dr. Ashby put a hand on his shoulder, squeezed, then turned to Kara. You should sit. You're going to tell me it's not good for the baby to make men with clipboards unhappy, Kara said. I'm going to tell you that stress makes your blood spicy, Ashby said. And spicy blood teaches tiny hearts bad songs. Kara eased onto the bench, Samuel warm and ridiculously alive against her. For a length of breaths she allowed herself to shake. The Ardent thumped into the ring 15 minutes later. Arlen took in the scene the way a man learns accidents, details first, feelings later. The coil gun scuffed where Tom had dropped it, the lantern lamp still lit, the door log open on the panel. He said nothing. He crossed the room, knelt by Kara, touched Samuel's cap, and turned to the lock with a new shape to his jaw. We escalated, Dr. Ashby said. Or they did, Kara corrected. Both, Arlen said. He stood, and the old leaving in him twitched, the impulse to take a bag and dodge the fight. He caught it, pinned it to the floor of himself, and felt it kick before it died. Lantern call, he said. All arcs. Tonight. They packed the cargo ring without shouting. Concordant had taught them to be quiet when they were angry. Arlen laid out what had happened in 12 sentences. Clay added 4 words, they will come armed. Jonah said, then so will we, and Tom lifted his chin the way 19-year-old men do when they want to live up to guns they have no business holding. No, Dr. Ashby said. Some of you will come armed. All of you will come fed and rested. Fletcher? Kara asked. I sent the file at mid-shift, the doctor said. He replied with one word, coming. What about the marshal? Someone called. Depends whether he likes law enough to wear it when it's heavy, Clay said. They slept in shifts that night, if you can call it sleep when the mind rehearses the angles of doors. Arlen lay with Samuel asleep along his forearm and counted the seconds in each lantern pulse. Kara lay beside him and did not close her eyes. When she did, she saw a Blackwood smile fall on her child like snow. At dawn cycle, boots rang on the spine. Concordant had found uniforms with brass that caught corridor light. 12 men. Not a war. Just enough to make slaughter feel bureaucratic. Their leader today wore a different face and the same grin. Captain Carrin, he called through the lock, by order of the tribunal, Concordant Minerals will be taking secure custody of. He held up a sheet of paper. Kara didn't open the lock. She read the file through the viewport, lips moving. Arlen watched her eyes. It's not signed, she said. Mistake, the man said. A clerk's oversight. Bring me ink, she said. With a judge's name in it. They'll be here, he said, which meant they weren't. The corridor behind Kara filled with people but not noise. Jonas with his wrench. The baker with a ladle that could kill if swung brave. Tom, color returned, coil gun clipped to a strap so his hands were free to help reload or hold a crying toddler. When the first man reached for the override, Kara lifted the rifle from the wall and let its weight speak. She didn't point it at a heart. She held it down and ready, the way the old cowhands do when they want to make a new widow only if asked. Step back, she said. Don't force us to remember your face. Their leader hesitated, not at the rifle, but at the room behind it. He had expected a family. He saw a town. Last chance, he said. Yours, she answered. He inhaled to make good on his threat, and the lantern net flickered 3 times fast. A new sound rolled up the spine, the sound uniforms make when they're worn by people you hired instead of people you bought. The marshal stepped into view with 2 deputies and a tired man in a dark coat whose eyes looked like they had learned what rooms do to people who lie. Harrison Fletcher. Advocate. Stand down, the marshal said to Concordance men without raising his voice. This ring is under court protection pending hearing. We have an order, the leader said. You have a prop, Fletcher replied. He took the paper without touching the man and looked at it the way surgeons look at things they can no longer save. No signature. Nice font. You can't stop. I already did, the marshal said, not bothering to lift his badge. Now leave before I count you all and run out of patience. The leader thought about sums and headlines and retreated into the grammar of men who promise you they will come again with better nouns. The line of uniforms turned like a school of fish that had been taught how to lose gracefully. The lock sealed. The ring exhaled. Kara set the rifle back on the wall. Her hands didn't shake until she let them. Arlen stepped in close, pressed his forehead to hers, felt the station's hum pass through both of them like a pulse. "We hold," he said. "We testify," Fletcher corrected gently, stepping forward. He set an old-fashioned brief on the table, opened it, and pulled out a stack of pages that smelled like ink and labor. "And we win where it sticks." Kara nodded. "Then let's teach the room how to listen." Samuel woke and fussed. Dr. Ashby scooped him up and jostled until the fuss turned into a sigh. The lantern net blinked all's well twice and then went quiet because sometimes quiet is the most beautiful thing in a place that has learned to expect alarms. Outside the viewport, rocks turned in their old river. The skimmer that had worn Trust undocked without looking back. They would return. But so would everyone else. The belt remembered. Chapter 7, Standoff at Broken Arrow. The injunction hearing took a week to schedule and 10 minutes to almost ruin. Concordant arrived with briefcases that tried to look heavier than the law. Fletcher carried one that actually was. The tribunal's room was a slice of borrowed dignity, plastic wood, tired flag, lights that flatlined faces. Kara's boots squeaked once on the floor, tiny treachery of a station woman on a planet that pretended it wasn't. Arlen stood beside her in a shirt Tom had ironed like he could press fear out of cotton. Blackwood opened with sympathy. "They always do. No one wishes these good people harm," he told the judge, who had eyes like a hawk waiting for a rabbit to stop pretending it's a rock. "But the spectral vein act is clear. Subsurface rights are meaningless if the subsurface is a lie," Fletcher said, gentle enough to pass for polite. He placed a puck on the table. The lights dimmed. Hollow swept up, maps of the ring, grav lines, neutrino scatter. No ore. No vein. No color. No taste. What there is, triangulation beacons in a field never licensed for survey by Concordant or any subsidiary. "Your Honor, they aren't miners. They're a stalking horse for a rail spur." Blackwood smiled the slow smile a man uses when he walks into a trap and hopes the trap has bad springs. "Conjecture." Fletcher slid a beacon across the table in a bag. "Cereal shaved. Adhesive fresh. Residue matched to concordant procurement via a supplier who sent us an invoice and an apology. Conspiracy is a hard word. Fraud is an ugly one. Choose your headline." The judge did not smile. He looked at the men at the table and saw ages of theft wearing today's coats. "Provisional protection continues," he said. "Full hearing on the merits in 6 weeks. Concordant will not approach the property with personnel or instruments in the interim. Violations will be treated as," he glanced at the marshal, "I believe the term is armed robbery." Gavel. Stamps. The clerk's pen scratched a sentence with edges. Outside, Blackwood found Kara and angled his body to block the corridor like a man who had never been taught he could be small. "You want to pause," he said. "You won't win the play." Kara watched his mouth make the mistake of believing it could shape her day. "I have a lantern in every corridor," she said. "And a town that knows what it means when they blink. Do you have anything like that, Mr. Blackwood? Any place that would stand for you?" He didn't answer. Men who rent loyalty never do. Concordant didn't waste 6 weeks. They came on the third dusk, before the ink had dried in the clerk's log. They did not knock. They brought more men this time and a captain who wore rank like a surplus he hadn't earned. They lined the spine outside Broken Arrow's lock and read nothing out loud. The lantern net pulsed once, twice, and then a coated river of light ran through the ring. "Come." Jonas arrived first, because he lived 2 hatches away and believed in being inconvenient to bullies. A line cook came still wearing her apron. A pilot on leave, 2 water techs, an old miner with a limp, a grandmother with a dart gun, a freight runner with his hands still in a glass cast. A town. Arlen stood with them. He had set Samuel in Clay's arms with a look that asked the tracker to do something he didn't know how to do, be soft, and Clay had nodded once, which is a whole speech for a man like him. Kara keyed the intercom. State your business. Captain Brass smiled for the cam. Business is a word your kind uses when you want to feel equal to men who make reality. Stand aside. Where's your order? She asked. He held up a tablet. The judge's stamp glared back. Fletcher, at Arlen's shoulder, took the device, examined it, lifted an eyebrow. Clever, he said. Stamp is real. The content it's stamped on isn't. Enough, the captain said, tone clipped. Open or we cut. Marshal? Kara asked the corridor. Here, the marshal said from behind the wall of townspeople who had become his office. And tired. Everyone laughed, not long, not cruel, just enough to remind themselves what they were. Captain, the marshal continued, you took the wrong job today. Back up your men. The judge is writing. You won't like it when the gavel has a face. The captain's mouth tightened because he had not built a career on retreat. Men, he said. Weapons came up. So did 100 palms. Empty. Open. A gesture from older wars and deeper law that says we will not start this and you will not like it if you do. Something shifted then. The moment when the distance between decision and death collapses. You could feel the station listening. And then hooves in the old stories became boots in this one, the judge himself stepping through the crowd with a clerk at his elbow, breath fast, coat flung wrong. Stand down, he barked at Concordance line with a fury that belonged to fathers. Arrest anyone who doesn't. The captain had the sense God gives men who want to keep waking up. He lowered his weapon. The line followed. Fletcher's breath left him like a man who had held it too long. Kara set her rifle back on its hook inside the lock. The marshal took the captain's tablet and snapped it in half with hands that had broken worse. I'll expect your full counsel in Cheyenne, Mr. Blackwood, the judge said, appearing from a corridor with his tie crooked and his eyes hard. Bring a toothbrush. Blackwood wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. He was watching from a feed in a room that smelled like fresh fruit and bad promises, making notes on which of his men would be promoted for failing decorously. The crowd didn't cheer. No one had won anything yet, only refused to lose in public. But relief moved through them like air. Tom leaned his head against the rail above the lock and closed his eyes for one long beat. Clay shifted Samuel to his other arm with the surprised competence of a man who'd never expected to touch new life with hands used to tracking weathered ends. Dr. Ashby checked 3 pulses without asking for wrists because she could tell by faces. Kara's shoulders dropped a degree. Arlen wrapped his fingers around the rail to keep from grabbing her and carrying her somewhere private to shake in peace. The judge nodded to Fletcher. 6 weeks, he said. Bring me a case that makes a new rule. We already have, Fletcher replied. We're just going to teach the room how to read it. The captain gathered his men with a curt motion and left with the kind of efficiency that buys you another contract when this one falls apart. The lantern net blinked all's well once, then held dark long enough to feel like prayer. Outside the viewport, the belt rolled on, unconcerned and perfect. It is not the stars' job to care. That's ours. They fought the last part in papers and rooms. Fletcher wrote in a voice that made judges feel brave. Kara testified like a woman who'd learned to count her own breaths and tax the ones who tried to take them. Arlen explained beacons to a clerk who asked if neutrinos were edible. Clay swore a quiet oath that pulled maps out of shadows. When the decision came, it had the exact weight of the hours they had paid, heavy, right, costly. Fraud, said the ruling. Enjoined. Damages. A bar on concordance operations in the reach. A footnote about beacons that would be taught in law schools to children who might never have to stand in a corridor with a coil gun shaking and decide not to shoot first. Blackwood sent no letter. He rarely spoke when a room stopped listening. The marshal bought the first round at the baker's, which is not how anything is supposed to work and exactly how the good parts do. The judge had a cup of coffee at Kara's table and did not pretend he had won this for them. He said, "Law is better than luck." Fletcher slept for 20 hours and woke up asking for stew. Arlen went to the viewport with Samuel in the crook of his arm and stared until the rocks stopped looking like teeth. "We didn't build peace," he said to no one in particular. "No," Kara said, stepping into the reflection beside him. "We built a place that makes war expensive." He laughed, low. "I'll take it." She slipped her hand into his. "So will he," she said, meaning the small weight, and the larger future. The Ardent sat in her berth, hull scarred, heart good. Clay polished a rail that did not notice and hummed a tune he might teach someone someday. Outside, the stars wrote their slow, indifferent poem. Inside, people wrote faster ones in heat and bread and the blink code that means we are here. Chapter 8, What the Stars Remember. The jump spur came anyway. Not the way Concordant wanted, on a timeline that turned people into numbers and numbers into rail. Years later, negotiated, paid for, announced at a town meet where Kara made the company rep hold the microphone and listen while the room taught him the difference between right-of-way and right. They laid pylons across the belt like careful stitches. The Ardent flew escort for the survey ships, Clay in the jump seat correcting men who had never learned that good math includes fear. The lantern net added a color for show-off and used it every time a rail crew tried to run a drone too hot through a family's orbit. When the first train slid through the hole space makes when you pay it enough to break, the station shuddered in a way that felt like a dream you don't tell anyone because it seems like bragging. Freight came. Medicine. Children who learned the alphabet from signs no one had promised would ever be hung here. Gentry 8 stopped squeaking. Not because money came, the ring kept her aches like heirlooms, but because people who used to choose between repair and food could choose both twice. Broken Arrow's algae beds doubled and the air tasted greener. The recycler sang in a key Dr. Ashby announced was "See hopeful," which is not a thing music recognizes and absolutely true. Kara carried more children than she had planned and exactly as many as her life decided, Samuel first, stubborn and small, Elise 2 springs later, loud and fast, then twins like comets, carving laughter through the galley, then a quiet boy who preferred screws to spoons, then a daughter who wanted to argue with everyone about everything and, infuriatingly, was right half the time. She ran the ring with a ledger and a look. Men who tried to sell her things they didn't understand learned to count better. Arlen learned how to stay. He took the midnight runs because babies breathe easier when their father walks the spine at 3 a.m. with a mug and a hum. He taught Tom to lead crews without shouting, which is better engineering than people think. He let the Ardent be borrowed by the sort of projects that carve a town into firmer letters on the map. He argued with Kara about money in a way that made both of them richer without being right. Clay surprised no one more than himself by marrying a woman who ran air through plants with fingers that made meters out of leaves. He held Samuel on a balcony when the boy turned 9 and handed him a coil gun and said, "You'll never fire first," and Samuel said, "I already know," and Clay cried like a man whose eyes had forgotten they could make water warm. Dr. Ashby built a clinic that smelled like soap and certainty. She hung a plaque made of hull scrap in the waiting room that read "We ask for consent" and meant it about needles and about everything else. She delivered babies whose parents named them after rocks and stars and one named Injunction because their mother had a sense of humor that made the nurse cough to keep from laughing. Fletcher visited once a year, a pilgrim to a church he had helped build without believing in anything but sentences. He brought candy for the children and terrible ties for Arlen and new case law for Kara to read in bed when she couldn't sleep because someone had put a beacon somewhere that wasn't supposed to have one and her hands itched to pull it down. Blackwood moved to a different theater, as men like that do. Perhaps he won. Perhaps he learned the difference between cannot and should not and quit. More likely he found a room that tolerated him longer. If he thought of the ring, it was as a line on a resume, a place he had failed to convert, a useful scar. The stars did not keep his name. The marshal retired and took up teaching children how to say no without getting shot. Jonas opened a repair stall that fixed things the rails said were cheaper to replace. The baker never let her ladle go cold. The grandmother taught darts to teenagers who would never have to shoot anyone and so shot paper circles with focus that made them dangerous in better ways. The day the spur opened for passengers, the town threw a festival because people who come from scarcity are the best at excess when it can be harmless. Lanterns hung in colors that had never been assigned code. The judge sent a letter that said simply proud. Music found a tempo that felt like not bracing. Kara stood on the gantry with a microphone because she had learned to like the sound of her own voice when it told the truth. We did not defeat a company, she told the crowd, eyes bright green and steady. We taught the law how to see us. We taught each other when to come running. We taught our children that a family is a station is a town. Arlen watched her and remembered the first time she had said tomorrow in a corridor that smelled like burned dust. He took Samuel's hand, no longer wrist bone small, now big enough to curl around his own, and squeezed. Samuel squeezed back, and the squeeze had the shape of a promise to show up for other people's lanterns someday. Night cycle fell in a way it hadn't in the years of fear, gentle instead of ominous. The lantern net blinked lazily with no code at all, just light for the pleasure of it. The belt rolled. The train whispered through its cut in space and did not sound like conquest. It sounded like the absurd idea that human beings could keep showing up for each other long enough for a place to change into something it had always wanted to be. Later, when the stalls closed and babies were carried home asleep, Arlen and Kara walked the skin and watched the rail thread the dark. Their suits clicked against the truss. Their breath made fog halos that broke and mended with each exhale. "Do you ever think about Denver?" Arlen asked. He hadn't said the name in a long time. Cities don't remember men like him, they devour and burp. Sometimes, she admitted. When the bills stack. When the pump sticks. When Samuel says he wants to fly further than the spur and my bones want to hide him behind a wall. "You want to run?" he asked. "No," she said, and her laugh was warm in his ear over the calm. "I want to hold. You taught me that's a different muscle." He touched his helmet to hers, glass to glass, making a small, private world. "We hold," he said. "Until it's someone else's turn," she said. "And then we teach them how." They stood like that until the cold argued them back inside. In the galley, the cradle was empty because the child it had held had outgrown it and the future it had promised. Arlen poured 2 cups, 1 coffee, 1 tea, and they sat in the recycler bay, the warmest room still, and let the wild hum of useful machines carry their silence. "Do you know what the stars remember?" Kara asked at last, eyes on the viewport where the belt painted its old poem. "Everything," Arlen said, and then shook his head. "Nothing. They remember light," she said. "We make our own." He reached across the table and took her hand, scar to scar, ring to ring. Outside, a lantern blinked without needing to say anything. Inside, 2 people who had once been clauses in other men's plans kept choosing each other. The station hummed in Sea Hopeful. The rail whispered. The boy who had been born under knives and winter grew into a man who fixed things and wrote laws and taught kids how to count pulses when the power dipped. He married a woman who could talk a judge into crying and a miner into washing his hands. They moved 2 hatches down and argued about bread like it mattered because it does. Kara and Arlen grew older in the slow, lovely way people do when they are allowed to without constantly flinching. Their backs hurt. Their jokes improved. Their love learned the trick of becoming less dramatic and more permanent. On an evening like any other, they argued about a gasket and then kissed like the gasket had been the point, which is what you get when you do vows right. If the stars remember anything at all about this place, and it is not their job to, let it be this: a ring held by hands that refused to let go, a net of lamps that meant come, children sleeping while trains threaded through the dark like careful needles, and 2 people who turned a clause into a home. If this story left a little hum in your chest, if you felt the lanterns blink and the station steady under your feet, come ride with us again. Tap subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula. Out here, we don't promise easy skies, we promise true ones, and the kind of endings the stars might remember.